Alright, so welcome to this video looking at how we can access an API in order to retrieve data from it. So in this particular example, we're going to look at the Marvel Developer API, which is an API designed to allow you to access data from previous comic books that Marvel has produced. And, you can then use that as part of your particular solution. So just hide that for a second. So you can see here we've got the Marvel Developer site, so developer.marvel.com. All right, and I guess even if you're looking at an API for the first time, a lot of them have a lot of similar features, including documentation and how to get into it and how it all works. As well as obviously being able to create an account. So I have already logged in. I know it doesn't look it up here, but have logged into the account. But if we have a look at the how-tos, the getting started in this case is really nice. It sort of goes through the general rules around getting a key, terms of use, attribution and linking. So obviously if we're using their data, we should attribute the fact that we are using their data. And obviously trying to keep in touch with them about what you're building, so creating a bit of a community there. So a lot of APIs are very similar in that sense. They provide the data, they're hoping you provide the use for that data. All right, so we can have a look at some of the other stuff. General information is very general. So the endpoint for any request is gateway.marvel.com. Right, and it talks about things like authentications and that sort of thing there. We'll probably get into that more as we get into actually coding and seeing what we can see. The API results is also important. So when you get the API back, it's a JSON object. Alright, so it's two parts to the object. The first part is what we call a wrapper, which just has the very general information about it. And then within that wrapper, you'll then get the data. So the data sits in, I guess, an object of its own with some of this stuff. And then the actual results is the data that you've requested. And so that'll become important when we actually filter through and try to access the particular data that we want. Alright, but again, some of these will come up as we go through. The other stuff is probably not the most important at this time. So some entity types as well. So this just sort of helps explain what information is there. So for things like URLs, text objects, the resource list, images. So when you're looking at images that are stored in the API, those sorts of things. So characters, comics, so these are the different types of bits of data we can tease out. So characters within the comic books, the comics themselves, creators, so the people who wrote the books, events and series, so that's like special within the comic books, and certain storylines as well. Alright, so some stuff there around authorization and attribution and rate limits. So authorization just means, how to access it with the keys. So this is an important bit to understand, and we'll break this stuff down as we go through the code as well. And the attribution, what's happened there? I've lost the menu. Attribution and rate limit. So generally with APIs, you can only access them a certain amount of times. It stops people from, clogging the server with requests. So this one's 1,000 calls a day. So if you wanted something to be continuously updated and repeated, you'd have to set it so that it only calls up to 1,000 times a day. So you split that up amongst 24 hours. That's what, about 40 requests an hour. So maybe, one every 90 seconds would be there. I don't know how strong my maths is there. Alright, so you can see the attribution, that should be on the screen. So you need to consider that with the interface side of things. We're not going to look at that today. It's purely just accessing the data from the API. There's also some interactive documentation here. So what this is just you can go in and actually search for specific things. So you can see here we've got characters, characters with character ID. So we can actually search for a character by their ID. All right, so here we just put in the value. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. And it should return status 404, so we couldn't find that character. So maybe there's not that many characters. 1, 2, 3. Actually, I think I've skipped something over here. I should have looked at the range of characters. It doesn't say. Well, I guess if we do want to have a look, we could use characters. So we're going to fetch, the list of characters. If we try it out just as is without anything. So there you go. You can see why the number was nowhere near. So 101, 134. We can pick another one. We don't necessarily want the first one. There's a big guard on there for that character. So you can see there's a lot of data here. So I guess the more specific you make it, the more detailed your results will be. But we'll use this one. So 10, 17, 100. Beautiful. Just copy that. Let's go back up. Hide that. So if we bring that into here, hide out, you can see it returns a bomb and the description and so on. So we'll use this as a starting point, and we'll go from there. So when we get our results in Python, they should look like this to begin with down here. So this is a good way to check. All right, so as we said, the other thing is we need to get a key. So like I said, I have signed in and created an account. So if I go to my account, okay, that's why it's got a different name. Couldn't work out why I couldn't access it before. I was using normal account name. So you can see you get two keys, a public key and a private key. So basically the public key is what will appear within the URL request. And so when we go type that in, we'll have a look at that again. You'll sort of see where that lines up. And then you have a private key. So the private key is for you only. And you'll see that we will actually encrypt it so that people can't see the key as part of the request. I have 3,000 calls a day, so I must have done something wrong to get that many. And then, yeah, you can see I can only request from developer.marvel.com with all of this. But this is the bit of information that we need. So we've done that first step. We're on our way to accessing the API. All right, so now we need to start putting in some code. So to do that, we're going to create a new file. And straight away, let's save it. So just create a new folder. So Marvel API. Right, and I'm just going to call this marvel.py. So the py is obviously important because it's a Python file. Right, we want to be able to code in Python. And just to get set up, I'm going to import a few libraries. So I'm going to import a library called requests. And so depending on your version of Python, you may actually need to add that using pip, time, and hash lib. So time and hash lib should be included in your Python build. Requests you may have to import using pip or install using pip, I should say. I won't go through that. We've talked about installing packages in pip before, so we'll get into the good stuff. All right, so the next thing is we need to consider that we've got 3 parameters that we need to pass into our request. All right, so we need a timestamp, so I'm just going to call that TS for timestamp. And just put a timestamp there. It's going to have an error because I haven't actually assigned anything to it yet. the public key, so public key, which I'm going to get from the API account. And then with our private key, we're not just going to use the private key as is, although we do need to pass it in. But what we're going to do with the private key is we need to hash it with our timestamp, private key, and public key all together. Alright, so let's set all this up first, and then we'll do the hashing. So with the timestamp, it's going to be a string version of time.time. So basically within the time library, we're running the time method, which returns with us the actual time. And we're going to just turn that into a string so that we can manipulate it with the other variables. So with the public key and private key, we're taking our keys from our API account. And we do need to put these in quotations, so double quotes, single quotes, doesn't particularly matter. Alright, so private key, copy and paste. Probably better than trying to type it out. You make one mistake here and it's all going to go sideways. Alright, so as we said, we need to pass in the timestamp, the public key, and then the hashed version of all of these together. So we'll create a variable called hash string, and its purpose is just to put all of these together. So we've got TS plus the private key. So these do have to go in the right order too. So even though I didn't set them in that order, that's okay. Public key. Alright, so when we're adding strings together, it literally just mashes them together, which is fine. And then our actual hashed variable is going to be from the hash library. We need to use the MD5 algorithm, which is a form of hashing. And as you may or may not know, hashing is what we call a one-way encryption. So we can't actually decrypt this particular encryption, but the idea is when they test it, they will hash the combination of everything and make sure that it matches. So obviously at the API end, they have our public key and private key. They know that, but I guess when we send the request, we don't want the private key to be out there in the open, so we hash it along with everything else, again just to make it harder to find. And then the API and they'll sort of do the same thing, and if it matches, great. If not, well, there's an error. Alright, so what we're hashing is the hash string, and then we need to do a couple other fancy things here. So we're going to encode, and this is just basically making sure that the character set is what we want, which is UTF-8. And then we want to run another method called hex digest. So when we encrypt or hash our string, we want to turn it into its hexadecimal form. So that's how the API will process it. So that's how we want to send it. All right. So now that we've got our hash set up, along with our public key and our timestamp, we're going to actually create a dictionary called parameters. So what this is going to do is just sort of hold everything so that when we create the request, it'll put all of them together. Right, so what's important with this dictionary is the keys that we assign. So TS is for our timestamp, and we just called it TS, so that's nice and easy. Right, so even though I called it public key as a variable, the key in this dictionary that we need is API key. All right, so this is how it's going to identify it in the request at the API end, not primary key, sorry. Public key. And a hash variable is simply going to be hash. Well, I will save that. Control S is your friend. Obviously won't do too much just yet. But we've laid the groundwork for being able to request the API. And I might have skipped through a little bit there, but if we come back, I'll quickly show you how you can generate that for other APIs. So it comes from the authorization section. So you can see it talks about a timestamp and a hash, which is an MD5 digest. So that's the hex digest bit of code of the timestamp, your private key, and your public key. You can see it's basically adding all those together and hashing it with the MD5, which is what we've done in Python. All right, you can see that your request should look something like this if you were to print it out, and we could probably print it out and test it once we set up the rest of the request. Now you'll see it says gateway, we're going to get from the comics, we're going to use a timestamp, and it's not going to equal 1, it's going to equal a lot longer number. The API key, which is going to be, again, quite longer than 1, 2, 3, 4. And then our hash. So that's about the right length of the MD5 hash. I don't know how many characters are there. But yeah, it's basically all those things together, put in the algorithm, that's what comes out. Alright, so we're going to use this HTTP gateway marvel.com v1/public. And if we go back to, I think it was general information, see that API results, you can see that's the absolute base layer. Alright, I think then in the API results it talks about some of those more specifics. No? Interactive documentation, that's the one. So you can see after the gateway.marvel.com, they all start with v1/public, and then depending whether you want characters and all that sort of deal. I just realised I've lost my original character ID. We'll try and make it up. See how we go. All right, so as we said, now we're going to put together that request. So what we want to do is we'll set up a variable called gateway. With this, we're just going to say http / gateway.marvel.com. You have a choice here whether you want to add the v1 and public. As we said, that is pretty common to all of them. All right, so I might actually do that just to save us some time. Public. And then search. So just looking at my sample code, I've actually got one here for a comic of the value 1111. That's worked out well. All right, so what this is going to do is basically tack that on the end. And so then our full URL is going to be the gateway search. You could probably do this in the next line, but sometimes it helps to see how everything comes together by separating it, particularly when we're first learning how to do it. And then we're going to formalize our request. So our request is going to come from saying requests.get. So using the request library, we want to get some data, and we want to get it from our URL. So that's the first parameter we have to pass in. We also need to pass in params, which is short for parameters. And it's going to take that dictionary that we already created called parameters and tack these on the end. So we're going to get http gateway marvel.com v1 public /comics/1111. Then it's going to go the and timestamp equals timestamp, API key equals our public key, and the hash equals our hash. So if we wanted to check that, we could print our request and see what that returns. All right, so let's give it a run. Just thinking about it. Might just be trying to request. Alright, so we get a bit stuck here. So let's try and be a bit more specific. So with our request, we want to look for its status code. Maybe there's an issue why it's not returning the whole request. Spin that again. Alright, so I guess if we encounter a situation like this where it looks like it's working but it's not really working, there's probably a big reason for that. And if it's a situation like mine, then I'm pretty sure that's the reason why. So if you're on your home network or you're on a private school network, you might actually be able to get in and get the request and the status code and all that straight away. However, I'm working on the Education Queensland network at the moment. So part of that is whenever I'm accessing the internet, I need to include proxy authorization. So, when you sign in with your username and password to access the internet. All right, so we can actually do that. So it takes a little bit more work, and I suppose what you could do is you could build this in and sort of set it up as if required, include the proxy. If not, then you don't need to. All right, but we'll go through it. So the first thing we need to do is import the operating system library, and this will just help us with accessing our username, so we don't have to type in our username. It's really handy for that. But then within our request package, we do want a couple of specifics. So from the authorization library, we want to import HTTP proxy auth, so basically a method that's set up for adding in the proxy authorization. And also I'm going to add in another method called getPass. So from getPass, import getPass. So basically this will just protect the passwords. When I type it in, it won't show up on screen, which is going to be useful for me displaying this for you. Right, so obviously if you did want to have the password protected on any application and you're typing it in the console, getPass is that way around that. All right, so we need to create some initial variables for our proxy details. So we'll do this after the parameters. So username and password are the big two. So as I said, we can use the fact that I'm currently logged on to a Education Queensland system by saying get username. Obviously you could just enter this in manually if you wanted to. And same deal with password, but like I said, because I am showing this to the world and I don't necessarily want everyone to see my password, I'm going to use the getPass method just to hide those details. Then we need to set up our proxy. So with our proxy, there's two things we need to consider. We need to add this as part of a library. So the first one is if we have a HTTP request, so not without the colon. The colon goes afterwards. All right, and in that case, we're going to use proxy2.eq.edu.au:80. So that's the particular port that we're using. And the other type of request is we may have a HTTPS request. So in that case, it's a little bit different. HTTPS, then what we want to do is add in the username. Plus, we then add in a colon. Plus password. Again, I suppose it, oh, not with the quotes, because it's the variable. Just separate that out a little bit so it's a bit neater. Obviously, if you're just doing this for your own testing purposes, you could potentially hard code these in. But again, if we're going to make a solution that suits everyone, we might as well go the extra mile. So proxy2.eq.edu.au colon 80. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to look very similar to this, except for the fact that it's going to insert the username and password in there. So that's part of the secure HTTP request. So the proxy authorization that we're going to set up is simply running the HTTP proxy authorization for our username and password. All right, so once we've got that set up, we do need to include them in our request. So after our parameters, we can say proxies equal to our proxy that we set up. So that's our addresses. And the authorization of the proxy will be our proxy authorization variable. All right, let's save. Let's just in that instance and run, see how we go. So you can see it's asked for a password, which is more progress than before. So I'll just make sure I've clicked in the right spot. Looks like it. Hopefully I don't stuff up the password. And there you go. So you can see it's returned 200, which is our status code for our request. So if you're ever not sure about the status code, these are all provided in the documentation. Is it this one or the next one? So you can see here there's a few that say status code 200, which basically means that the request has been successful. API results, I think, might have the actual list. Yeah, so typical result, code 200, status okay, so on and so forth. Where's the... There is definitely the list of errors somewhere. I remember seeing it. No, not in images. Attribution, rate limits. No, it'll be the last one I look in. There we go. Authorization errors. That's what it should have been, of course. So you can see if you get these different errors like 409, it means one of the variables was missing from the request, whether that's the key, the hash, the timestamp. 401 means it was invalid, so you know you've used an incorrect one. Method not allowed, so if you're not allowed to use that particular word, so like we use get, which is fine. And obviously we had 404 before, so when we were doing the interactive documentation, it said that it wasn't found. So if I go back to comics, actually I was in characters before, wasn't I? But that's okay. We did say we're going to look for the comics with a specific value. So comic ID, that's one we want. So if we type in 1111, try it out. You can see that we're supposed to get a code of 200, and we're getting Peter Parker, Spider-Man Volume 4, Trials and Tribulations. So this is the particular comic that we're getting the data for. All right, so if we want to see the full request, now that we've got the status code, we should just be able to print the request, and this will give us that full object. Again, I've got to do the password every time, which is a little bit annoying. better than having to change my password. So it just says response 200. That's fine. There is actually a little bit to displaying the data. All right, so once we've got that status code up and running, as we talked about previously, if we go back to the result, you'll see it does come up as an object which contains, this wrapper on the top level, and then within it the data, and also then gives us the results as a list. Obviously, because we're searching a single comic book, this is going to only have one element in the list. All right, but this will become important once we get into looking at the data. All right, so the first thing we want to do if we want to get into the specifics is, because it's a JSON object, we actually have to treat it as a JSON object. So by taking this request and running the .json, it's basically, instead of going to just giving us the basic return or response 200, it's going to give us all of that JSON data that we can see in the documentation. So once again, just make sure I get the password right. And there you go, you can start to see all the data. It's not formatted in any way, shape or form. But if we look very closely, try and find it. There you go, you can see name, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, Volume 4, Trials and Tribulations. So we know that we're on the right track because we're getting the data that we can see in the documentation in our results. All right, but obviously we don't necessarily need all of this. So if we want to then start getting into the specifics, because it's a JSON object and it acts like a dictionary, we can start to say, well, we only want the data part of this. So, we don't necessarily want the code, the status, and so on. So if we run this again, it's going to be a little bit tedious having to keep typing the password. But you can see it doesn't start at the code, it starts at offset limit. So that's actually what is equal to our data. So you can see data equals offset limit, so on. All right, we can continue going. So if we go into the results, so again, this shouldn't give us the offset limit. This should start here. So it should give us ID, digital ID, title, so on like that. Actually, I'll just clear this out. Might make it a little bit easier to differentiate. All right, and we look, so yeah, it starts at ID and so on. So then if we wanted to get the title, we can't just go straight into title, because if we were to do that and run it, and we'll do the request, you can see it spits back an error saying list indices must be integers or slices, not strings. All right, and that's because if we look at the result, you can see that it's got a square bracket there, which represents a list in Python. All right, so essentially all of this is the first item in the list. All right, so we do have to go in, and in a set of square brackets, we just say element 0, so the first one. But if we give that a run, again, password, you can see now we've just got the title, Peter Parker, Spider-Man Volume 4, Trials and Tribulations. All right, so that's how we get down to our particulars in terms of the results. Might just quickly, I know this video has gone on a little long, apologies for that, but just quickly, I guess, look at an example of how we can use this to iterate through. So we do need something that has more than one result, which might be, what if we just do comics? Characters. Oh, we need our character first, don't we? So character ID, what was it, about a 7-digit number? So 00170. Let's try it. There you go, we got one. So our lane is this one. Cool. All right, so say we want to find a series of comic books with this character in it. So under our, oh, no, sorry, this one here, so character ID comics. So we'd have to put in that number. And if we try it out, so it doesn't have any, that's a bit flat. So it is successful, but there's no particular comics with that character, so I'm not sure why the character's there, to be honest. We'll just do a very general one then. Let's do comics. We've already got comics set up. Scroll down. Here we go. Comics. So let's try it out. So basically what we're doing here is we're requesting all the comics. So you can see it gives us a count of 20. So basically it's only going to give us 20 results. You can see in the results we've got Marvel previews. If I scroll down a bit more. Yeah, so this one, Marvel preview, so that's the same thing but in a different year. Yeah. Or is it the same? All right, anyway, what we'll do is we'll go through these 20 results. So you can see that this automatically limits it at 20. You could change the limit. Or if you wanted to get 20 each time, you'd get the first 20 and then, the offset would be 20 and the limit would be 40 because the count would be 20. All right, but we'll just look at this one just to keep it nice and simple. All right, so if we have a look at the comics, I think we need that in general. So if we save that and we run it, this should only give us the first title, which should be that Marvel, what's it called? Marvel previews. There you go. I was just waiting for it to tell me on the screen. But obviously, if we've got 20 requests there, or 20 comics there that we can use. So all we would have to do is say for just a simple counted loop. So count in range of 20. Print our count. It's at a 0, whichever the count is up to, so it'll start at 0 and work its way through. There you go, and you can see once we've done that, so the 3 were all the same, that's why I was confused. All right, but then you can see a few different titles there, and we've got a total of 20 titles all up. All right, if you did want to adjust it, just I guess one more quick one, dragging this on forever and ever. As I said, if you wanted to change the limit, actually we don't want to change the offset. So if we say 20, try it out. And once it's done, it should tell us how it's different. Yes, you can see Century of the Trade paperback, which I believe should, oh no, it's the next one after that. We should have done from 19 so we could see the 20th entry. All right, but you can see what we have to add in is another parameter, just saying offset of 20. And then you'll see the and symbol there as well. So if we add that in just real quick, comics question mark offset equals 20. Save. Again. So the list should start with Century. Yep, the trade paperback, Storm, and so on. Alright, so that's how you can get multiple bits of data out at the same time. Obviously, we've just looked at the titles, but as suggested previously, you've got things like issue number, the ISBN might be useful. So some text that's in there as well. If you scroll down, probably a really good one to use, if I can ever find it, is the thumbnails and images. So you may want to show the comic books on screen for a particular character. So that's how you would access those. All right, but hopefully that gives you a fair understanding of how to access an API, but also interact with its documentation. And then also, like I said, for those tricky situations, like having a tightly secured network, like the Education Queensland network, how you can add in the proxy details so that you can get the request through.